We were told the story of Bluebeard, a wealthy nobleman who murdered his wives, hiding their corpses behind a forbidden door until a curious bride discovered the secret chamber and escaped with her brother's help. A cautionary tale about female disobedience, packaged for children's bedtime stories. The archives reveal something far more sinister. There were no murdered wives. There was no forbidden chamber filled with women's bodies. There was no rescue by noble brothers. There was Gilles de Rais, a war hero who rode alongside Joan of Arc, a man who systematically tortured and murdered over 140 children in 15th century Brittany. Not wives, children, peasant boys aged 8 to 15, lured into his castles with promises of fine clothing and escape from starvation. Charles Perrault's 1697 fairy tale, published over 2 centuries after the crimes, deliberately erased these victims. By transforming murdered children into murdered wives, by replacing systematic predation against the vulnerable with a morality tale about curiosity, the story protected not victims, but the reputation of an aristocratic class that exploited the defenseless with absolute impunity. The real corpses were buried twice, once in unmarked graves, and once beneath the sanitized fiction we still tell our children today. The world that produced Gilles de Rais was one where human suffering existed as background noise, unremarkable and unrecorded. 15th century Brittany bore the economic scars of the Hundred Years' War, a conflict that had systematically drained peasant resources for over a century. The landscape itself spoke of devastation, villages with collapsed roofs abandoned to the elements, roads lined with the bleached bones of livestock that had succumbed during failed harvests. The smell of the countryside was not the romantic pastoral of modern imagination. It was the stench of human and animal waste, rotting vegetation in ditches, and the acrid smoke from cooking fires that had no chimneys. Peasant hovels were single-room structures with dirt floors, where entire families lived in absolute darkness through the winter months. The olfactory environment was one of constant assault, unwashed bodies pressed together for warmth, infected wounds that would fester and kill, the particular odor of disease-ridden animals crowded in enclosed spaces. The poverty was absolute and inescapable. A peasant family might own a single cow, the loss of which through illness meant certain starvation. Winter brought the most terror, grain stores depleted by autumn, children developing rickets from nutritional deficiency, entire villages losing 20 to 30% of their population to disease and hunger. Taxation was relentless. The feudal obligation system demanded that peasants provide free labor to their lord, work roads, maintain fortifications, and surrender portions of their already insufficient crops. The church demanded tithes. There was no escape. A peasant could not leave their land without permission, could not own property without the Lord's sanction, could not even marry without approval. Children in such households were economic liabilities, additional mouths to feed from an already insufficient harvest. When a nobleman's servant approached a village and offered a child food, shelter, and fine clothing in exchange for service in a grand castle, it represented genuine salvation from certain slow starvation. The promise was not implausible. Wealthy nobles did employ child servants, and the desperation was genuine. This was the psychology of vulnerability that Gilles de Rais exploited with methodical precision. The world was one where peasant children simply disappeared regularly, sold to other lords, sent to cities, lost to disease, and no questions were asked. Death for the poor was administrative, unmarked, and unsurprising. In the thick stone walls of medieval castles, where the air hung heavy with the acrid smoke of wet wood burning in stone hearths, where tallow candles provided the only light in windowless chambers, where the walls themselves wept condensation that never dried, creating surfaces coated with algae and mold. In these spaces, children discovered that their salvation was their tomb. The sound of iron-bound doors slamming shut, each one sealed with a bolt, each deeper chamber, each lower tower, the auditory marker of escape routes being systematically eliminated. The finality of that closing sound, repeated with each descent into darkness. The transformation of Gilles de Rais from war hero to predator reveals the architecture of human evil in its purest form. This was not madness in any clinical sense, but the methodical application of aristocratic privilege to the systematic destruction of innocence. Gilles began as everything medieval society celebrated, a young Breton nobleman whose courage at Orléans earned him Joan of Arc's personal trust. When she fell wounded by an English arrow, it was Gilles who caught her, carried her to safety, removed her armor with his own hands to tend her wounds. He was 24 years old, Marshal of France, a genuine hero in an age that desperately needed them. But Joan represented something that shattered conventional understanding. A peasant girl who claimed direct communication with divine voices, who led armies, who embodied spiritual authority that transcended every feudal hierarchy. She was the sacred made manifest in human form. When she was captured in 1431 and burned by English-aligned authorities, Gilles possessed the wealth to ransom her. He made no attempt. This passivity reveals the first fracture in his psychology. He had internalized Joan's apparent acceptance of martyrdom as divinely ordained. Resistance would be heresy. The war ended. Gilles returned to his estates, and something essential had been broken. He became obsessed with alchemical experiments, spending vast fortunes on magicians and necromancers who promised to summon demons. His family intervened desperately, petitioning the Pope in 1435 to prevent him from selling more property to finance these delusions. But by then, the real horror had already begun. Between 1432 and 1433, his methodology crystallized. He groomed victims through false hospitality, selecting children specifically for their beauty. Once inside his castles, he dressed them in fine clothing that marked them as belonging to his household, creating a false sense of protection and status. Then came the violence that served no purpose except the infliction of suffering. His accomplices were fully complicit. Henriette and Poitou, his personal servants, became expert at identifying suitable victims. François Prelati, an Italian alchemist and probable lover, provided the theological justification that demonic forces could be summoned through specific ritual acts, that the suffering of children was cosmically necessary. Gilles' stated motivations evolved under interrogation. Early confessions attributed his crimes to idleness and excessive drinking. Later testimony revealed his explicit belief that he was performing sacrificial rituals that would grant him supernatural power. He spoke of the pleasure derived from killing, described selecting victims for their beauty, admitted to weeping over the severed heads of the most attractive ones. This is the profile of grandiose fantasy combined with profound spiritual trauma. He believed himself conducting sacred rituals, that his victims were offerings to occult forces, that through their deaths he might resurrect Joan of Arc or access forbidden knowledge. The psychological architecture was one of aristocratic entitlement, weaponized by religious delusion. His social position granted him dominion over the bodies of those beneath him, and his spiritual crisis provided the justification. But the true antagonist was not individual pathology, it was structural immunity. For 8 years, he murdered with impunity because peasant children simply were not counted in the official ledger of humanity. Justice mobilized only when he made the mistake of attacking a clergyman, violating the protection of the church. The forensic reality emerged through accumulated witness testimony and physical evidence that could not be denied. When investigators examined his principal castle at Champtos in 1438, they found approximately 40 complete or partial child skeletons in a sealed tower room, stored with deliberate care rather than hastily concealed. The bones revealed trauma patterns that spoke with clinical precision. Fractures to long bones indicated blunt force trauma applied while victims were still alive. Spiral fractures of the femur and tibia occur only when bones are twisted during life. Perimortem damage to skulls showed the application of extreme force. The victims ranged from 8 to 15 years old, predominantly male. Some skeletons remained articulated, suggesting they had been positioned shortly after soft tissue decomposition, approximately 6 to 8 months post-mortem. Heavy metal staining on skull fragments indicated prolonged moisture exposure, suggesting bodies had been stored in sealed chambers or weighted down in water before transfer to the tower. Witness testimony revealed the methodical nature of the process. Perrin Martin, a household servant, testified to personally leading a 12-year-old boy to Mushekul Castle, where he was handed to the porter and never seen again. Other witnesses described a conduit filled with dead little children at Champtos, suggesting bodies were disposed of through the castle's water system. Under interrogation, Henriette and Potto provided descriptions that went beyond simple murder. They described Gilles selecting victims based on physical beauty, changing them into fine clothing to create false security, then inflicting violence that was purely predatory. The children were alive during the primary violence. Torture extended over hours. Death came through blood loss or asphyxiation. Post-mortem mutilation followed ritualistic patterns. Gilles would select the most beautiful severed heads, kiss them, weep over them. Bodies were then burned, with remains disposed of systematically, some cast into rivers, others scattered in fields, others reduced to ash and mixed with household waste. The ecclesiastical court's indictment listed 140 children. Contemporary sources suggest numbers as high as 600 to 800. What cannot be disputed is the systematic nature of the predation, the deliberate targeting of the vulnerable, and the explicit enjoyment derived from suffering. This was crime that was industrial in scale, the routinized elimination of human beings whose disappearance generated no institutional alarm, precisely because they occupied the lowest stratum of feudal society. The physical evidence paints a picture of methodical horror, conducted with the efficiency of a functioning bureaucracy and the protection of absolute power. October 26, 1440. Dawn breaks over the Loire Valley with the particular clarity that accompanies executions. By 6 in the morning, crowds have begun gathering on the Aile de Biesse. Word has spread through Nantes like plague. The great lord who fought beside Joan of Arc will die today for crimes that defy comprehension. At 9 o'clock, the procession begins. Gilles de Rais, Baron de Retz, Marshal of France, emerges from his cell in chains. The man who once commanded armies now walks between guards toward a scaffold, erected specifically for his destruction. The crowd swells as he approaches. Mothers whose children vanished, servants who witnessed horrors, nobles who profited from his downfall. Noon arrives with autumn light, filtering through bare trees. Gilles kneels before the assembled thousands and speaks his final words, a confession, an apology, a plea for divine mercy. His voice carries across the silent crowd, the same voice that once rallied soldiers at Orléans, that recited Latin prayers in his private chapel, that whispered instructions to servants disposing of small bodies in castle towers. The rope tightens at 12:30. For 8 minutes, Gilles de Rais struggles against the hemp that ends his breathing. Then stillness. His body is cut down before the flames below can consume it completely, a final aristocratic privilege, ensuring Christian burial. Henriette and Poitou burn to ash beside the scaffold, their screams echoing across the Loire until silence returns. By dusk, the crowd disperses. The scaffold is dismantled. The ashes are scattered. Within 3 years, King Charles VII will issue letters declaring Gilles unduly condemned. The first act in a rehabilitation that transforms child killer into tragic hero, historical fact into literary metaphor. This is why we invented fairy tales, to bury what we cannot bear to remember. The Bluebeard myth endures because it performs the essential cultural function of all propaganda. It takes unbearable truth and makes it consumable. We transform the systematic exploitation of the powerless into stories about individual evil overcome by virtue. We replace murdered children with rescued wives. We locate horror in the past, in castles, in the safely distant realm of once upon a time. But the bones remain. Beneath every sanitized retelling lies the fundamental truth that Gilles de Rais embodied. Power creates its own permissions. For 8 years, he operated with complete impunity, not because he was uniquely monstrous, but because the system that elevated him was designed to protect those who served its interests, regardless of the cost to those beneath them. The fairy tale asks us to believe that evil can be identified, isolated, and defeated. History reveals that evil is structural, systemic, and protected by the very narratives we tell ourselves about justice and heroism. We execute the individual while preserving the machinery that created him. Gilles de Rais died in 1440, but the logic that enabled his crimes survives in every story that asks us to focus on the monster rather than the system that fed him. The vulnerable continue to disappear while we debate the literary merit of the tales told about their vanishing. We are all complicit in the stories we choose to remember and the ones we choose